What would you do if you found out your wife was cheating? What if everything you thought you knew about your life was a lie? In this gripping tale of betrayal, revenge, and the search for redemption, follow the journey of a man whose world is turned upside down. When his wife's shocking affair is exposed, he's forced to confront painful truths and make decisions that could change everything. Will he forgive her, or will he take matters into his own hands? Stay with us as secrets unravel, trust shatters, and lives are forever altered. The truth might just be more than he can handle. Are you ready to face the storm? John sat in his chair, staring out the window at the empty streets. The neighborhood he once felt connected to now seemed so distant. His once thriving career had slipped through his fingers, swept away by a combination of bad luck and a company that had no room for someone like him anymore. The weight of the accident that had left him physically broken pressed on him every day. He could feel his life unraveling, piece by piece, and all he could do was watch. The silence in the house was deafening. Janet, his wife of 12 years, had become a stranger to him. Their shared laughter, the quiet evenings spent in each other's company, seemed like a distant memory. He felt the invisible wall between them growing taller and thicker with each passing day. He used to believe in the strength of their bond, but now it felt fragile, like a house built on sand. He reached for the glass of water on the table beside him, his fingers trembling slightly. His mind wandered back to the early days of their marriage. He remembered when they were young, before the world and its burdens had worn them down. They were inseparable then, two dreamers against the world. But now, he couldn't even remember the last time they had truly connected. There were no more quiet talks, no more shared hopes, just silence. And that silence was suffocating. "John," Janet's voice interrupted his thoughts. Her presence behind him was barely a whisper. "I think we need to talk." He turned slowly, meeting her eyes. Her gaze was weary, as if she too carried a burden she didn't know how to share. The weight in her eyes mirrored his own, and for a moment he felt a flicker of hope that maybe they could still find their way back. But that hope was fleeting. "About what?" he asked, his voice low and resigned. She hesitated, glancing at the floor, unsure. Then finally she spoke, her words coming out in a rush. "I can't do this anymore, John. I'm losing myself. I've been trying to hold it together for so long, but I can't." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The numbness he had been feeling for so long suddenly turned to something raw and painful. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like ages. Her face was etched with worry, her body language stiff and closed off. He felt his heart sink. He knew this wasn't just about him, not just about his career or the accident. There was something more, something deeper that had been building between them for a long time, something he had failed to see. "Janet," he started, but his voice faltered. "What are you saying?" She avoided his gaze, her fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of her shirt. "I don't know. I don't feel like I'm the person I used to be, and I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it isn't." John's heart clenched. The words felt like a betrayal, even though he knew they weren't meant to hurt him. "What do you mean? What's going on with us, Janet?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you, but I've been feeling so alone, so distant from you, and I don't know how to fix it." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. John could see the vulnerability in her eyes, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The woman he had loved, the woman he had fought for and shared his life with, was now a stranger standing before him, filled with doubts and fears he didn't know how to address. Is this the end?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want to hear the answer, but he had to ask. The silence between them was more deafening than any words could be. Janet's tears fell silently down her cheeks and she stepped closer to him, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "I don't know, John. I don't know if there's any way back for us." He didn't pull away, but the weight of her words crushed him. "I don't know if I can fix this," he muttered, staring at their joined hands. His voice broke, the walls he had built up around his heart slowly crumbling. "I don't know if I even know how to try anymore." There it was, The truth. He had tried to ignore it, to push it down, but now it was all too clear. He had no answers, no solutions. Just a growing sense of helplessness. The room seemed to close in on him. The air felt thick, the silence even heavier than before. His world was slipping through his fingers, and the woman he loved seemed to be slipping away with it. His mind raced, but there were no easy answers. Only pain, only confusion. "John," Janet whispered as if she wanted to say more, but the words caught in her throat. She was just as lost as he was. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for them to figure out what came next. But John couldn't think anymore. He only felt. And what he felt was the overwhelming weight of the crumbling foundation beneath them. John couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. Janet's words echoed in his head, each one a haunting reminder of how far they had fallen. The distance between them was more than just physical. It was emotional, a chasm that seemed impossible to cross. He had always believed in their bond, in the life they had built together. But now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, unbearable tension. Janet became increasingly distant, spending more time away from the house. She said it was for errands, meetings, or catching up with friends. But John could feel the coldness in her voice whenever she spoke. It wasn't just the time she was away. It was how little she seemed to care when she was home. He tried to talk to her, tried to bridge the gap that was growing every day. But every time he reached out, she pulled back further, as though she was afraid of something. Fear of him? Fear of facing the truth? The weight of it all became too much to bear. One afternoon, while Janet was out, John found himself standing in front of the dresser where she kept her things. He knew it was wrong, but a part of him had to know. He had to see for himself what was really happening. His hands shook as he opened the drawer, pulling out a small velvet pouch that contained her phone. He stared at it for a moment before unlocking the screen. Her texts were full of the usual messages, work reminders, appointments, updates about their kids, but one thread caught his eye. The name, Kin, appeared again and again. His stomach dropped. He clicked the thread open, his heart pounding in his chest. The messages were innocuous at first, just small talk and updates about their day. But as he scrolled, the tone shifted. Janet was no longer talking to Kin like a friend. She was talking to him like someone who mattered more than John did. His jaw tightened as he read, a sick feeling creeping into his chest. There were mentions of late-night phone calls, secret meetups, and words of affection he hadn't heard in years. "I miss you," one text read. "I can't wait to see you again." John's eyes burned as he read the last message. Janet had sent it just a few days ago. "I feel alive when I'm with you, more than I've felt in a long time." The words hit him like a slap across the face. He had never imagined something like this, not in his worst nightmares. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the screen, the weight of the betrayal sinking deeper with every word. It was as though the world around him had collapsed. All of the promises they had made to each other, all the years they had spent building their lives together, none of it mattered now. He wasn't just facing a cheating wife. He was facing the collapse of everything he thought he knew about his marriage. The sound of the front door opening snapped him out of his daze. Janet was home. He quickly put the phone back in the drawer, his hands shaking, and tried to calm his breath before she saw him. "John?" Janet called out, her voice sounding unusually soft. "Are you okay?" He turned slowly to face her, trying to mask the storm brewing inside him. But it was no use. She must have seen something in his eyes because her expression changed. The lightness in her face faded into something more guarded. "Is something wrong?" she asked, stepping closer. John stood there, frozen for a moment. He had so many questions, so much anger, but when he opened his mouth, the words that came out were quiet, almost like a whisper. "I know about Kin." His voice barely registered above a murmur, but the words seemed to echo in the room. Janet's face paled. Her eyes flickered to the floor, then back to him. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I read the texts," he continued, his voice shaking. "I know what's been going on." For the first time in years, he felt like he was seeing her for who she truly was. The woman who once vowed to love him forever, the woman who shared his dreams, was now a stranger standing before him, someone who had betrayed him, someone who had been hiding the truth from him for so long. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Janet finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you." The silence between them was thick, suffocating. John could barely hear his own thoughts over the pounding in his chest. "Then why did you?" The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. He didn't expect an answer, but he couldn't stop himself. "Why did you do this, Janet?" She stepped forward, her hands trembling as though she wanted to reach out to him but didn't know if he would let her. "John, please. I don't know. I've been so lost. And when he made me feel seen, like I wasn't invisible anymore. I thought I could fix things, but now I can't undo what I've done." John closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. The pain was so raw, so intense that it was almost impossible to bear. "You can't fix this," he said, his voice barely audible, his heart breaking with every word. "You've already destroyed it." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Janet stood there, silent, her eyes filled with regret. John wanted to scream, to throw everything in his path, but instead he felt nothing but emptiness. Everything he thought was real, everything he had fought for, was gone. He turned away from her then, not knowing if he could ever look at her the same way again. The silence between John and Janet was suffocating. It had been days since their confrontation, and yet the words still echoed in his mind. "I can't undo what I've done," Janet had said. She was sorry, but her apology felt empty, like a hollow echo in the vast emptiness of their home. John spent those days trapped in his own head, drowning in thoughts of betrayal and pain. He couldn't escape the images of Janet and Kin together, the texts, the secret meetings. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, their smiles, the way Janet had looked at him when she had confessed. It was as if the trust he had in her had never existed. He knew she was trying to make it right, but every time she reached out, he recoiled. He wanted to believe that she was still the woman he had married, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, but all he could see was the shadow of the woman who had betrayed him. "John, please talk to me." Janet's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes pleading, as if she were desperate for something to break the tension. He looked at her, but the sight of her only reminded him of everything that had shattered between them. What's left to say? His voice was cold, even to his own ears. "You've already told me everything I need to know." "I know I can't fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need you to understand. It wasn't just about Kin. It wasn't about him. It was about me, about how I felt invisible, like I wasn't even here anymore. I didn't mean for it to happen, but when I met him it felt like I was seen again." John's heart ached, but it wasn't with sympathy. It was frustration, a feeling of helplessness. How could he understand that? How could he ever understand how she could turn to someone else, how she could betray him like this after everything they had been through? "You think I don't feel invisible too?" he shot back. His voice was rising now, the bitterness spilling out before he could stop it. "I've been fighting every damn day to keep myself together. I'm not the same man I was, Janet. I can't be. And yet you go behind my back and fall into the arms of someone else. You don't think I feel invisible?" She flinched, the words hitting her harder than he had intended. But he couldn't stop now. The anger, the hurt, it had been building for so long. "You think I haven't noticed? You think I didn't see how you started drifting away? How you stopped looking at me like you used to? How you stopped even pretending to care?" Janet's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She was silent for a long time before she spoke again. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you." Her words felt hollow, like a reflex she had trained herself to say. "You didn't think about me when you were with him, did you?" John's voice cracked, a raw edge to it he couldn't hide. "You didn't think about me when you were sending those texts, when you were out there, lying to my face every day?" "I never meant for it to go that far," she whispered, stepping closer. "But I couldn't stop. I felt so empty, John. You've been in pain, I know that, but I felt like I had to live in that pain with you. I couldn't carry it anymore." Her words felt like knives, each one piercing deeper than the last. He had known their marriage had been struggling, but this was worse than anything he had imagined. She had built a world with someone else, a world where he didn't exist, where she didn't have to deal with the brokenness of their lives. "I wasn't enough for you, was I?" His voice was almost a whisper now, filled with the weight of realization. The realization that despite everything he had done, it was never going to be enough. "John, please." Janet reached for his hand, but he stepped back, the distance between them growing. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he said, the pain in his voice undeniable. He didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to be the man who couldn't forgive, who couldn't move on. But right now, all he could feel was the sting of her betrayal. The truth was, Janet had broken him, not just with the affair, but with her silence, her withdrawal. She had taken his love and crushed it beneath her need for validation. She had taken the trust he had placed in her and shattered it. The person she had once been was gone, replaced by a woman who didn't know how to love him, who didn't know how to hold on when things got tough. "I'm sorry," Janet repeated, her voice barely audible now. "I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I never meant to destroy us." John closed his eyes, willing the tears not to fall. He had been holding it together for so long, but now everything felt too heavy. He had loved her, and now he didn't know how to love her again. The lies, the secrets, it was all too much. But he wasn't the only one hurting. Janet had lost herself too, buried under the weight of her choices. He could see it now, the guilt, the regret written all over her face. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. John looked at her one last time, feeling the weight of their shattered bond. He didn't have the strength to hold on anymore. He needed to let go. John hadn't slept much since that day. The weight of the truth had crushed him, leaving him restless, filled with anger and sorrow he didn't know how to process. Each day was a blur of pain and disbelief, and yet, deep down, he felt the beginnings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a long time, the spark of hope. It had been weeks since their confrontation. Janet had tried over and over to reach out, to apologize, to rebuild what they had lost. But every time she came to him, every time she spoke, he recoiled. His heart wasn't ready for forgiveness, wasn't ready to even look at her the way he once did. But today, something had changed. Today, the fog seemed to lift a little. Janet had asked him once again to meet her at the kitchen table. She had been quieter lately, more distant, but he could see the effort in her eyes, the genuine desire to fix things. He walked into the kitchen, his mind heavy, his body tense. Janet sat at the table, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes watching him carefully. Her posture was more reserved than usual, and he could sense she was holding back. "John," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was a steady resolve behind it. "I need you to listen. I don't expect forgiveness. Not today. But I need you to understand why I did what I did." He stared at her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath as though preparing herself for something. "I've spent so much of my life feeling invisible. I was so consumed with trying to be perfect, trying to make everything right for you, for the kids. But I lost myself in the process. I didn't know who I was anymore. And when I met Kin, when he showed me attention, I thought maybe he could fill the emptiness inside me. I thought maybe it was the only way I could feel seen." Her words hung in the air, thick with emotion. John couldn't breathe for a moment. It wasn't just the affair that had hurt him. It was this. This was the truth he had been seeking, the reason behind the betrayal. She hadn't just fallen out of love with him, she had fallen out of love with herself. He swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten as the anger that had been simmering inside him began to shift. He was angry, yes, but there was something else too, something deeper, sadness, sorrow for her, for what she had lost, for what they had both lost. "I didn't know how to fix it," Janet continued, her voice breaking as she tried to hold back tears. "I thought I could fix me by being with him. But it wasn't him, John. It was me. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt us." The tears finally came, falling from her eyes in slow, heartbreaking streams. John couldn't bring himself to look away. He hadn't seen her cry like this in years. The woman who had always held herself together, who had always been so strong, was now broken. And he realized in that moment that she wasn't the only one who was broken. He was too. He walked over to her, slowly, carefully, unsure of what he was about to do. She didn't look up at him, her face buried in her hands. The sound of her sobs echoed in the quiet room, and for the first time he didn't feel the need to distance himself. He didn't feel the overwhelming need to push her away. Instead, he knelt down in front of her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. "Janet." His voice was soft, a stark contrast to the anger he had been holding onto for so long. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, lifting it so she could look at him. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but it was the look in them that struck him the most. The look of someone who had lost everything, someone who had fallen so far they didn't know how to rise again. "I'm not asking you to fix this," he said, his voice trembling, "but I need to know that you're really here, that you really see me, that you're not hiding anymore." Janet's breath caught in her throat as she nodded, her tears continuing to fall. "I see you, John, I see everything, and I'm so sorry for making you feel like you didn't matter. You've always mattered. You're the only one who's ever mattered, and I've taken that for granted." John's heart ached. He wanted to scream, to throw every emotion he had at her, but instead all he could do was pull her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs muffled against him, and for a moment it felt like the world had stopped. It felt like they were the only two people in the room, the only two people in the world sharing this pain, this sorrow together. But the pain wasn't over. The road to healing was long, and John knew that. He didn't know if he could ever fully forgive her, not yet at least. But in that moment, something changed. The first crack in the wall between them had appeared. The first spark of hope had lit up in the darkness. "I'm not going to forgive you today," he said softly, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "But I'll try. I'll try to understand. I'll try to heal. We both need to heal." Janet nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'll wait for as long as it takes, John. I'm here. I'll never leave again." And for the first time in a long time, John believed her. John sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on him. The phone was in his hand, but his fingers hovered above the screen, unsure. He had spent hours, days, even weeks replaying everything in his mind. The affair, the lies, the betrayal. And now, the most bitter of all, he had the chance to get back at Kin, the very man who had torn apart everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built with Janet. But what would it cost him? What kind of man would he become if he followed through with his plan? His thoughts flashed back to that night, to the texts that had exposed everything. He could still remember the hollow feeling in his chest as he read those words. Janet had been with Kin in ways that John could never imagine. His heart had shattered, not just because of the affair, but because of how much Janet had become someone else, how she had found solace in another man while he struggled, while he felt invisible, worthless. The idea of revenge was seductive. Kin's downfall would bring him some measure of justice, wouldn't it? But deep down, John knew that seeking revenge wouldn't restore what he had lost. It would only destroy what little was left. The sound of footsteps brought him out of his reverie. He didn't have to look up to know it was Janet. She had been giving him space, trying to give him room to breathe. But now he could feel the tension between them again, that same wall of silence. "John," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You've been so quiet lately. Please talk to me." He didn't respond at first, his gaze still fixed on the phone in his hand. The weight of his decision felt suffocating. Janet had asked for forgiveness. She had shown remorse. She was trying, but so much had been broken. "John, please," she urged again, this time moving closer, her voice filled with pain. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to make this right. I want us to find our way back, even if it's just a step at a time." He wanted to look at her, to speak the words that could ease her pain, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop thinking about Kin, about the way he had stepped into their lives so easily, so confidently. He had taken everything John had worked for, and the idea of him getting away with it, of him living his life without consequences, gnawed at him. The anger in John bubbled up, hotter now, sharper. The temptation to destroy Kin, to expose him for who he really was almost irresistible. "I'm not sure I can forgive you," John said finally, his voice low and strained. His words were like daggers, but they were the truth. "I'm not sure I can ever forget what you did. And now I have the chance to make him pay for everything, to make sure he feels the way I feel." Janet's eyes widened, her breath catching. "John, no, please don't. I know I've hurt you, but revenge, it won't fix anything." Her voice was filled with desperation, but John could hear the uncertainty in her words. She wasn't asking him to forgive her. She was asking him to heal, to move forward. But the hurt inside him was so deep, so raw. The betrayal felt like it had happened yesterday, like it was still fresh, still cutting him open. "You don't understand," he said, his voice tight. "You don't get how much this has destroyed me. I've lost everything, Janet. My career, my dignity, my trust in you. And he just gets to walk away? No, I won't let him. He doesn't deserve to get away with it." Janet stepped forward, reaching for him. But he pulled back, the distance between them more than physical. It was emotional, an unspoken divide that neither of them knew how to cross. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I know you're angry. I know you want justice. But revenge doesn't give you back what you've lost. It only makes the wound deeper. Please, don't destroy yourself too." The words hit him harder than he expected. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone tighter, the temptation to send the message, to make the call still hovering in his mind. But Janet's words, her plea, started to break through the anger, the rage that had clouded his judgment. He looked up at her, his gaze meeting hers for the first time in days. She wasn't just asking for forgiveness. She was asking him to see the bigger picture, to see that revenge would never bring them peace. It would only feed the anger, the hurt, and keep them stuck in a cycle of pain. "I don't want to destroy you, Janet," John said, his voice softer now. "I just don't know how to let go. I don't know how to stop the pain." She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant to cause you this much pain, but I will do whatever it takes to help you heal. I will fight for us. For you. For our family. I will do anything." John closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't just about Kin. It wasn't about punishing someone else to ease his pain. It was about finding a way to move forward, to rebuild trust, to rebuild their lives. He didn't know how to forgive yet, but in that moment, he realized something. Revenge wouldn't bring him peace. Only time, understanding, and perhaps in the future, forgiveness could do that. With a deep sigh, he put the phone down, his hands shaking, and looked back at Janet. For the first time in weeks, he saw her, really saw her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. "I'm not ready yet," he said quietly. "But I'll try. For us. I'll try." Janet nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "That's all I'm asking." John walked into the dimly lit living room, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for answers in the shadows. He hadn't been able to sleep much lately. The nights were restless, filled with the echoes of his thoughts. The conversation with Janet the night before, her plea for him to understand, for him to heal, still lingered in his mind. But there was something else now, something he hadn't expected, something that gnawed at him and kept him awake. The truth. It was one thing to know that Janet had betrayed him. It was another to understand why. The affair was one piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't the full picture. The more John thought about it, the more he realized that the pain wasn't just about the affair. It was about the secrets they had both been keeping from each other for years. And so, when he had gone through the papers on the desk earlier that day, he found something unexpected. A letter, one that Janet had never mentioned, one that she had likely forgotten about. It was a letter from her father, written years ago. It had been tucked away in a drawer, and it had been a mistake for John to look at it. But his curiosity got the better of him. He unfolded the letter slowly, as though afraid of what it might reveal. The handwriting was familiar, but the words made his stomach tighten. It was a letter Janet had written to her father, the one man who had been absent from her life for so long. The letter spoke of a deep rift between them, of a strained relationship that had never healed, and of a promise to never go back. The letter revealed a history of pain that Janet had never shared with him, a history that had shaped her in ways John could never have imagined. He had never known this part of her, the daughter who had been abandoned by her father, who had spent years hiding her hurt behind a mask of perfection. The Janet he had married, the one who had always seemed so strong, so in control, wasn't who he thought she was. She had been hiding pieces of herself from him for years, and now, in the midst of all the turmoil, John found himself questioning everything. The letter fell from his hands, landing softly on the floor. His mind was racing, his emotions a tangled mess. Could he truly understand her now? Could he truly forgive her for the pain she had caused, when the root of it all went back so much further than their marriage? Janet's voice broke his thoughts. "John?" she called from the kitchen, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" He stood up quickly, his heart racing as he forced himself to speak. "Yeah, I'm fine." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't true. Nothing about this situation was fine. He wasn't fine, and neither was Janet. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He didn't know what he wanted to say exactly, but he needed answers. He needed to understand. Janet appeared in the doorway, her eyes wary, as if she knew the conversation was coming. She walked toward him, slowly, her hands wringing together nervously. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but unsure. "I found something," John said, his gaze flicking to the floor where the letter lay. He didn't want to show her just yet, didn't want to reveal that he had uncovered her past before she had a chance to tell him, but the weight of it was too much to bear. "A letter. From your father." Janet froze, her face draining of color. "You shouldn't have," she started, but John cut her off. "No, Janet," he said, his voice hardening, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface rising to the top. "I need to know why you've kept this from me, why you never told me about your father, why you've kept so much of yourself hidden." Her eyes filled with tears, and she stepped back, as though the words he had spoken were too much to bear. "I didn't want you to know," she whispered. "I didn't want you to see that part of me. It's not something I talk about. It's too painful." John stared at her, the pain in her eyes mirroring his own. He had always thought their relationship was built on honesty, on trust. But now it felt like they had both been living in a house of mirrors, each reflection distorting the truth. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking, despite his attempt to remain calm. "All this time I thought I knew you, but now I realize I don't. I don't know the real you, Janet. I don't know who you've been hiding." Her tears were flowing freely now, and she sank to the floor in front of him, her face in her hands. "I was afraid," she said, her voice muffled by her hands. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd leave me, that you'd think I was broken, that I was beyond saving. I didn't want you to look at me like I was damaged." John stood there, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to comfort her. The woman he had married, the woman he had loved for so long, was finally unraveling in front of him. But the truth was, he didn't know how to fix her. He didn't know how to fix himself. He was just as broken as she was. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the quiet sobbing of Janet, her body trembling as if the weight of her past had finally caught up with her. And John, standing there, realizing that the truth of their lives together was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Finally, he knelt down beside her, his hand hesitantly resting on her shoulder. "I don't know what to do with all this, Janet," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I don't know how to fix what's been broken." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with regret. "I don't know either, but I'm here," I'm here and I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." And as John looked at her, he realized that for the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about revenge, about punishing anyone. He was thinking about the future, about whether they could truly rebuild what had been broken. It was unclear, uncertain, but perhaps for the first time, they were both ready to face the past together. The days that followed were a blur of uncomfortable silences and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. Janet and John had both agreed to move forward, to try to rebuild what had been lost. But the weight of their shared history hung over them like a cloud, casting everything in a shadow. They were two people who had been broken, and now they were trying to figure out if the pieces could fit together again. But how? John found himself waking up every morning with a tight knot in his chest. His body was physically tired, but his mind was constantly on edge, replaying the events of the past months, the months before, the years of their marriage. And then there were the messages. He could still see them, feel the sting of them as though they were etched into his memory. Kin, the man who had been so casually inserted into their lives, had torn apart everything John had once believed in. But now, something inside him had shifted. The anger was still there, but it wasn't consuming him anymore. Instead, it was the realization of what had truly been lost, the years he couldn't get back, the love that had been tainted, the future that seemed uncertain. It was late afternoon when the call came. John was in the kitchen, absently stirring a cup of coffee. Janet was in the other room, tidying up, her movements deliberate but stiff. She hadn't spoken much today, just like the day before. They were still walking on eggshells around each other, afraid of what might happen if they said the wrong thing. The phone rang and John glanced at it. It was an unknown number, but something about the ring unsettled him. Hesitating, he answered. "Hello? John, this is Billy." His voice was strained, like he was holding back something. "We need to talk. About Kin." John's heart skipped a beat. Kin. The man who had been at the center of the storm. The man who had made everything worse. "What's going on?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. But there was a crack in it, a sign of the anxiety building in his chest. "I don't know how to say this, but Kin's been caught up in some serious stuff," Billy continued. "You've got to hear this, man. It's bigger than we thought." John's stomach turned. This was it, the moment that could change everything. He had no idea what Billy meant by bigger than we thought, but he could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. Was this the fallout from the affair? Was this about the shady business deal he'd uncovered? "I'm on my way over," Billy said abruptly. "Don't make any decisions yet, but you need to know what's happening." The line went dead before John could say anything else. He put the phone down slowly, his mind racing. What did Billy mean? What kind of trouble had Kin gotten into? Janet came into the kitchen just as he set the phone down, her eyes searching his face. She could tell something had shifted in him, could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands clenched. "John, what's wrong?" Her voice was hesitant, but there was a genuine concern in her eyes. He turned to face her, struggling to find the words. "Billy just called. He said there's something going on with Kin. Something serious." Janet's face paled, her hand instinctively going to her mouth. "What do you mean, serious?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," John said, shaking his head. "But Billy's coming over. We need to talk." As he spoke, a sense of unease settled into the pit of his stomach. He could tell from Janet's expression that she was worried, but there was more beneath the surface. She wasn't just afraid for Kin, she was afraid of what this would mean for them, for their fragile attempt at healing. "I'll go get the girls," she said softly, but John barely heard her. His mind was already consumed with the unknown. He needed answers, but were the answers worth what it might cost? When Billy arrived, he was visibly shaken, his eyes darting around the room as though looking for something or someone. He barely acknowledged Janet's presence, focusing only on John. "Listen," Billy began, his voice tense. "I need to be up front with you. Kin's mixed up in some serious stuff. I'm talking criminal, fraud, money laundering. It's bad, John, and the worst part is he's dragged some people into it. People we know." John felt the air leave his lungs. His thoughts raced. This was more than just an affair. This was the man who had helped destroy his marriage, and now he was tangled up in something much darker. The reality of what that meant hit him like a wave. "You're telling me that he's a criminal?" John's voice barely caught as he spoke. Billy nodded grimly. "I've been trying to keep it quiet, but the more I find out, the worse it gets. He's been using people to cover his tracks, people who didn't even know what they were getting into." The silence between them grew heavy. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The betrayal of Janet wasn't just about their marriage anymore. It was about everything. His whole world was unraveling before his eyes. "You need to make a choice, John," Billy said, his voice softening. "You need to decide what you want to do with this. Ken's not just some guy anymore. He's dangerous. And if you get involved in this, there's no going back." John didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to run, wanted to hide from the mess that had become his life. But the other part of him, the part that wanted to make things right, that wanted justice, was urging him to confront this head on. "I don't know what to do," John muttered, his mind spinning. Janet, who had been standing silently in the corner, spoke up. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You do know, John. You've always known. This isn't just about Ken. It's about us, about what we're willing to fight for." John looked at her, the words cutting through him. She was right. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about making someone else pay for the pain he had endured. It was about him, about them, and what they were willing to face together. He looked back at Billy, who was waiting for his decision, and then at Janet, whose eyes held his with an understanding that both scared and comforted him. "I'm done hiding," John said, his voice finally steady. "We face this together. No more running, no more secrets." The weight of his decision hung in the air, but for the first time in weeks, John felt something like clarity. The truth would come out one way or another, and no matter what happened next, he would face the consequences. The days following John's decision to confront the truth were a blur of uncertainty and tentative steps. He had chosen to face the chaos, to embrace the rawness of the betrayal and the aftermath, but healing was never linear. It wasn't a simple path forward. It was a winding road, filled with obstacles and pain that they both had to navigate together. Each day they tried to rebuild. They spoke more, but the words were often fractured, hesitant. John found himself watching Janet in the quiet moments, wondering if she truly understood the depth of the hurt he still carried. She seemed so desperate, so willing to atone, but John wasn't sure if he could truly forgive her. And that uncertainty weighed on him more than anything. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence stretched between them. John pushed his food around on his plate, his mind a million miles away. Janet looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Was it hope? Fear? Maybe both. "John," she said, her voice soft but steady, as if she had been waiting for the right moment. "I know you're still angry, and I don't expect things to be perfect right away, but I need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Her words hung in the air, a fragile promise, one that John wasn't sure he could trust, not yet. His heart ached with the desire to believe her, to let go of the hurt that had built up inside him, but something still held him back. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to trust you again. I don't know if I can ever be the same person I was before." Janet's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't look away. She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. The warmth of her touch was a comfort, but it also felt like a reminder of everything that had been lost. "You don't have to be the same person," she said quietly. "You don't have to forgive me right now, but I need you to know that I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to help us heal." Her words pierced through him. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe that they could somehow fix what had been broken, that their love could survive this storm. But as much as he longed for that, he also knew that the road to healing was long, and that it would take more than just promises. Later that night, as John sat alone in their bedroom, his mind swirling with thoughts of the past, he found himself looking at the picture on the wall, one of their wedding photos. He had always loved that photo. It was a snapshot of a time when they were young, full of hope, full of dreams. A time before everything had changed. The reality of their situation hit him again, like a wave crashing over him. He wasn't the man he used to be, and neither was Janet. They had both changed. They had both been tested in ways they never expected. But was there a way forward? Was there a way to heal from this? The sound of footsteps behind him brought him back to the present. Janet was standing in the doorway watching him. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was also a quiet resolve in them. She had always been the strong one, but now John could see the vulnerability in her, the rawness of her own pain. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want us to just survive this, John. I don't want us to just go through the motions. I want us to really heal. I want us to find our way back to each other. But I can't do it alone. I need you. I need you to help me help us." John turned to face her, the weight of her words sinking in. The truth was, he didn't know if he could ever trust her again. But there was something in the way she spoke, something in the way she was standing there, vulnerable and raw, that made him realize something. They couldn't heal if they kept running from the truth. They couldn't heal if they didn't face what had happened, if they didn't confront the pain together. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready to let go of the anger. But I can try. I can try to let you in again. I can try to trust you again. I'm just scared." Janet stepped closer, her face softening as she placed her hand on his arm. "I'm scared too," she whispered. "But we can't heal if we don't start somewhere, even if it's just a small step. I'll take it with you. I'll take any step with you, John, because I love you. I never stopped." John looked into her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and pain, but they were in it together, and that made all the difference. "I'm willing to try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try to forgive you. I'll try to heal, but it's going to take time, and I need you to be patient with me." "I'll wait," Janet replied softly, "for as long as it takes." As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the room, John realized that the road to healing wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about learning to move forward step by step, even if those steps were small. It was about finding hope in each other, even when everything seemed broken. And in that moment, John knew one thing for sure. They weren't giving up on each other. Not yet. John sat on the back porch, the evening air cool against his skin. The sky was painted with the soft hues of a setting sun, and for a moment it almost felt peaceful. Almost. He took a slow, deep breath, the kind of breath that tried to clear his mind, tried to push away the weight of everything he'd been carrying for so long. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there. The quiet was comforting, but it also gave him too much room to think, too much space to reflect on everything that had happened, the betrayal, the anger, the pain, the pieces of their lives scattered on the floor of his heart, all tangled up with memories and regrets. His thoughts drifted back to the beginning, to the man he had been before all of this, before the affair had shattered the life they had built. It had been so easy back then, so simple. Love had been enough. But now, looking at the empty space beside him on the porch, he realized that love alone wasn't enough. Not when everything had been tainted by lies, by secrets. His eyes shifted toward the kitchen window. Janet was inside, probably preparing dinner for the two of them, trying to fill the silence with some sense of normalcy. He hadn't spoken much to her since the conversation they had days ago. The words, though honest and raw, had been hard to digest. She had confessed everything, her pain, her fear of losing herself, her search for validation in another man. But even with all of that laid bare, the trust between them still felt so fragile, so easily broken. "John," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Janet stood in the doorway, her face soft but full of concern. She had come outside quietly, as though she didn't want to disturb his solitude. But the moment her eyes met his, he saw the anxiety there. It was always there now, hovering between them like a ghost. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer immediately, just kept looking at her. It was strange how he could look at her and still feel so distant. How could he sit there, feeling both close to her and so far away at the same time? "I'm fine," he said finally. The words felt hollow, but it was the best he could offer. Janet stepped onto the porch, joining him silently. She sat beside him, her body language tense, but there was something vulnerable in the way she looked at him. It was as if she was waiting for him to say something, anything, to show her that he hadn't given up. The silence stretched between them again, longer this time. John's mind wandered back to their conversation a few days ago. He had heard her. He had felt the pain in her voice, but it hadn't made the decision to forgive any easier. Forgiveness wasn't a simple thing. It wasn't something you just gave away after an apology. It was a battle inside, a struggle to reconcile the past with the present, and he didn't know if he could find that peace. "You don't have to say anything," Janet said softly, breaking the silence. She glanced at him, her voice filled with the same weariness that had been weighing on her for days. "I know things aren't fixed. I know it's hard, John, but I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm really here. I'm not going anywhere." He turned to her then, seeing the truth in her eyes, the sincerity of her words. And for the first time in a long while he felt something stir inside him, something fragile, something like hope, mixed with a deep sense of exhaustion. "I don't know what to say to you anymore," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost lost in the wind. "I want to believe you, Janet. I want to believe that we can fix this. But every time I think about it, I don't know. The pain is still here." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I know," she said gently. "I know the pain doesn't go away overnight, and I'm not asking you to forget. But I'm asking you to give us a chance. I'm asking you to not give up on us yet." John closed his eyes for a moment, taking in her words. His heart ached. He wanted so badly to hold on to what they had, to pull her close and let everything go. But there were still too many questions, too many layers of hurt that hadn't healed. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's changed, Janet. I'm not the man I was before this happened, and I don't think you are either." She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "No," she agreed quietly. "We're not the same, but we don't have to be the same. We can still choose to move forward. I don't know how to fix everything, but I know that I want to try. I want to try for us, John, for our family." The tears in her eyes were real, raw, and John felt a pang in his chest as he watched her struggle to keep her composure. She wasn't asking him for forgiveness in the way he had expected. She wasn't demanding that he forget. She was just asking him to take that step forward, no matter how small it was. "I'm scared," he confessed, his voice shaking slightly. "Scared that it's too late. Scared that I'll never be able to forgive you." Janet reached out, her hand resting on his arm gently. "I'm scared too," she whispered, "but we can't heal if we don't face this. If we don't try, then we're just letting everything fall apart. And I can't do that. Not with you." The sincerity in her voice was enough to stop him in his tracks. Maybe they weren't ready to heal completely. Maybe forgiveness wasn't going to come easily. But in that moment, John realized that they could still try. They could try, together, even if it was one small step at a time. "Okay," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Okay, we'll try." And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. John sat in the car, staring out of the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The weight of the moment had pressed down on him for days now, ever since the conversation with Janet had turned to the future. It was strange how quickly things could change, how swiftly a moment of clarity could slip into uncertainty. He had asked for time to think, time to sort through the mess inside his head. But now, as he sat there in the quiet of the car, there was no more time left. He had to make a decision that would determine everything. The future of his marriage, his relationship with his children, his sense of self. Could he truly forgive Janet? Could he accept the person she had become after everything had fallen apart? The air was thick with the silence of anticipation, but it wasn't just his silence. It was the silence between them, the one that had settled over their home in the last few weeks. It was a silence that spoke of unresolved tension, of unsaid words, and of fear. Fear that maybe, just maybe, the love they had fought so hard to preserve wasn't enough. John had spent so much time wondering if he could forgive her, if he could let go of the anger and the hurt. But now, he wasn't so sure. He was so tired, so drained by everything, the affair, the lies, the secrets. And yet, as he thought about the years they had spent together, the family they had built, the moments of joy they had shared, he realized that this decision wasn't just about revenge or betrayal. It was about love, or the fragments of it that were left between them. The car door creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Janet standing there, her face pale, her eyes filled with concern. She had been waiting for him. He could see the fear in her eyes, fear that the decision he would make today would destroy them for good. "John, she started, her voice breaking slightly as she took a step forward. "I know it's been hard. I know I've hurt you more than anyone should ever have to bear. But I need you to know that I'm sorry, and that I want to make this right. I want to fight for us, for our family." John closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words wash over him. He wanted so badly to reach for her, to pull her close, to let the weight of the past few months dissolve in the light of her sincerity. But his heart still felt heavy, the wound still fresh. Could he really forgive her? Could he really put the past behind him and rebuild what they had lost? "I don't know, Janet," he whispered, the words choking in his throat. "I don't know if I can." She took a tentative step toward him, her hand outstretched. "I don't expect you to just forget what I did. I don't expect things to go back to normal overnight. But I need you to understand. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about me, too. I can't change what happened. But I can change what I do from here on out. I can change for you, for us." Her voice trembled, and John could hear the rawness in it, the desperation to make things right. And yet the more she spoke, the more John realized something. This wasn't just about forgiving her. It wasn't just about repairing the damage to their relationship. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental. Janet wasn't just asking for forgiveness. She was asking for a chance to heal. She was asking him to see her, not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as the woman who wanted to make amends, who wanted to fight for their future together. John's heart was torn in two. The pain was still there, sharp and undeniable. But so was the love he still felt for her, the love that had been buried beneath layers of hurt and mistrust. The question wasn't whether he could forgive her, it was whether he could trust her again. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw the woman he had once known. Not the woman who had made mistakes, not the woman who had hurt him, but the woman who was standing in front of him, vulnerable and raw, asking for a second chance. "I don't know if I can trust you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to. I really want to." Janet's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. She just reached for him, and this time John didn't pull away. He let her come close, let her wrap her arms around him. The warmth of her embrace felt foreign, yet strangely familiar, like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. "I don't know what the future holds, Janet," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I'm willing to try, for us, for our family." Janet's tears fell freely now, and she held him tighter. "I will do anything, John, anything to prove to you that I'm here, that I'm worth the chance." John closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling in his chest. There were no guarantees, there was no promise that everything would be okay. But for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. He felt like maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. They could face the consequences of their past and still find a way to move forward. "I'm ready," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm ready to try." The final decision had been made. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't predict. But for now, they had each other. And that was enough. The mornings were quieter now. John had noticed it, the stillness that had replaced the chaos of his thoughts. It was a slow kind of silence, the type that filled the spaces between words and lingered like a shadow in the corners of the room. He and Janet had agreed to rebuild what had been broken. But trying wasn't the same as healing, and healing wasn't something that could be rushed, no matter how much they both wanted it to happen quickly. John found himself awake early, long before the sun had risen, his thoughts tangled and restless. He knew what was coming today. It was a simple task, a mundane task, really, but it meant more than just the routine. Today, Janet had suggested they take a walk, just the two of them, to talk. It was a small step, but it felt like the first one toward something bigger. He sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, waiting for Janet to come downstairs. He had been reflecting a lot on the past week, on the moment when they had finally opened up to each other, when they had spoken their truths. That night, when she had stood in front of him, vulnerable and willing to fight for their marriage, he had seen something he hadn't expected. He had seen a woman willing to face the consequences, willing to be honest and raw. But still, the pain lingered. The trust had been shattered, and trust, he knew now, wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. "John?" Janet's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes searching his face, trying to read his thoughts. She had changed in the past few days, too. There was a new sense of determination in her, a quiet strength that had emerged as she fought to repair the damage. But even with all her efforts, John could see the cracks, the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability that was still there. She was scared too, scared that they wouldn't make it, scared that the damage might be too deep to fix. "I'm ready," he said, standing up from the table. His voice was steady, but he could feel the tightness in his chest. They hadn't spoken much about what came next, about how they would rebuild, but they both knew that something had to change. And this walk, this simple gesture, felt like the beginning. They stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against their skin. John could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the trees and the distant hum of traffic. It was a quiet morning, one that felt like the calm before the storm. Neither of them said anything for a few moments, their footsteps crunching on the gravel of the driveway. Janet walked beside him, close but not touching, as if testing the space between them. Finally, Janet spoke. "Do you ever think about the way things were before everything changed?" John looked at her, taking in the uncertainty in her voice. He knew what she was asking. She wanted to know if he remembered the good times, if he could still see the life they had before the affair, before the lies. He thought about it for a moment, about the moments when they had been happy, when they had been a team, partners in every sense of the word. "I think about it all the time," he said quietly. "I think about the way it used to be, how easy everything seemed, how simple." He paused, taking in a deep breath. "But then, everything changed, and now I don't know if I can ever go back to that. I don't know if I can ever trust the way I did before." Janet's eyes filled with tears and she stopped walking. John turned to face her, the pain in her expression almost too much to bear. He had seen her cry before, but this was different. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything they had lost, everything they had yet to find. "I know I've hurt you," she said softly, her voice shaking. "And I don't blame you for not trusting me. I've broken that trust, and I know that words won't fix it, but I need you to know. I'm not giving up. I'll do whatever it takes. I just need you to believe that." John felt the familiar sting of tears, but he held them back. He couldn't break down now, not yet. He had to be strong for both of them. "I want to believe you, Janet. I really do." His voice was hoarse, filled with the weight of everything he had been holding in. "But every time I try, it's like there's a wall between us. I don't know how to break it down." She took a step closer to him, her hand trembling as she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his, the touch soft and tentative, but it was enough. "We'll break it down together," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "One day at a time, one step at a time." For a moment, they stood there in silence, holding each other's gaze, the unspoken understanding passing between them. John knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when the pain was too much to bear, days when the trust seemed impossible to rebuild. But as he looked into Janet's eyes, he saw something that made him want to try, something that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. "I'm scared too," he admitted quietly. "Scared that we won't make it. Scared that we'll keep hurting each other." "We will," Janet whispered, stepping closer, her forehead resting against his. "But we'll do it together, and that's what matters." The words hung in the air, a fragile promise that neither of them knew if they could keep. But for the first time in a long time, John felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the next step, to keep moving forward. And as they stood there together in the quiet of the morning, John realized that the road ahead would be long. There would be struggles, setbacks, and pain. But they weren't giving up. Not today. Not ever. The house was quiet. It had been days since John and Janet had started to rebuild, and yet the silence in their home seemed almost overwhelming. It was no longer the painful silence of unresolved anger, but one that felt unfamiliar, tentative, as if each person was waiting for the other to make the first move. It was as though they were on the edge of something big, but neither of them knew how to take that final step. John sat on the couch, staring out of the window, his hands resting in his lap. The morning light poured into the room, casting soft shadows across the floor. He felt it, the weight of the past few months, the weight of everything they had gone through, the betrayal, the anger, the fear. It was all still there, lingering like a shadow at the edges of his consciousness. And yet, there was something different now, something that felt new. It was the way Janet had looked at him this morning, the way she had touched his arm with that quiet sincerity. It wasn't just the apology, it wasn't just the promises she had made. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be put into words. They were moving forward, one step at a time, but they were moving forward together. As the door opened behind him, he felt a familiar presence enter the room. He turned to see Janet standing in the doorway, her face soft but filled with a quiet strength. She hadn't said much over the past few days. Instead, she had let her actions speak for her. Small gestures like making his coffee in the morning or offering him a smile when he least expected it. She took a step forward, her eyes meeting his. "Hey," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth and uncertainty. "I was thinking, maybe we could try something new today. Just the two of us. What do you think?" John felt a smile tug at the corners of his lips. For the first time in a while, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the weight lifting off his chest, or maybe it was just the simple gesture of her wanting to try again. But whatever it was, it felt like a new beginning. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of emotion. "I think that sounds good." Janet smiled, her eyes lighting up. She walked toward him, and for the first time in a long while, John didn't feel the need to brace himself. He didn't feel the usual tension in his body. Instead, he felt peace. A quiet, fragile peace that had been absent for far too long. "Let's take a walk," she suggested, her voice almost hesitant. But there was something in her tone that made John want to believe in the possibility of their future. "Just like we did that day. We'll walk, talk, and maybe just be." John nodded, standing up and stretching his back. It had been a long time since they had just been together. No secrets, no hidden agendas, no walls between them. "All right," he said, his voice low but full of promise. "Let's go." They walked out the door side by side, the sunlight catching in Janet's hair. The world outside felt different today. The air felt fresher, lighter, as if it had been washed clean by their shared decision to move forward. As they walked, there was an ease in the way they moved together, a comfort, almost like the world had slowed down just for them. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of their footsteps the only noise between them. John didn't feel the need to rush the conversation. He didn't need to say everything at once. It was enough to just be here, in this moment. Janet was the first to break the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said, about us not being the same," she said, her voice quiet but steady. And you're right. We're not the same. We've changed. But I think that's okay. We're still us. We're still John and Janet. John looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, but also the strength. She wasn't asking for his forgiveness anymore. She wasn't pleading for him to erase the past. She was asking for a chance to move forward. And that, in itself, was something he had never expected. Yeah, he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. We're still us. But maybe we can be better together. Her eyes softened and she reached out, taking his hand in hers. The simple touch, the warmth of her fingers against his, felt like a promise. They weren't starting over. They were building something new from what was left. And that was enough. As they continued walking, John felt the familiar weight of his doubts, his fears. But they didn't seem as heavy now. They were still there, lingering like shadows, but they no longer defined them. They no longer ruled their future. I know it's not going to be easy, Janet said, breaking the silence again. But we're going to do this. We're going to make it. John nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, raw hope that maybe they could make it. Maybe they could rebuild, not just the marriage they had once had, but the love they had almost lost. I believe that, he said, his voice filled with more conviction than he had felt in months. The two of them walked in silence for a while, their hands intertwined, the bond between them slowly but surely becoming stronger with each step. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what the future held. But they were together, and that was all that mattered for now. As they reached the park, they sat on a bench together, side by side. The air was still, the world around them peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, John could breathe again. The weight of the past had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled them. Together they had made a choice to face the future, not as broken people, but as two people willing to fight for what mattered most. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, the road felt like one they could walk together. It had been weeks since they had taken that first step forward. Weeks since the air in their home had shifted from silence to tentative hope. But now, as John sat in the living room, his mind swirling with thoughts of the past, he knew that forgiveness was still a mountain they had to climb together. The past still lingered like a shadow, haunting him, and the question that gnawed at him every day was simple. Could he forgive her? Janet had changed. She had become more patient, more present. But that didn't make the process of forgiveness any easier. Each day, she reached out to him in small ways. Through a gentle touch, a warm smile, a kind word. She was trying. But it was hard to ignore the wreckage of their past, the betrayal that had shattered everything they had built. The sound of footsteps behind him brought him out of his reverie. Janet stood in the doorway, her eyes soft but filled with uncertainty. She had always known how to read him, how to sense when something was off. She didn't need to ask, she could tell something was on his mind. "John," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, "I know it's been hard for you. I know you're still struggling, but I need to know, are you ready to forgive me?" Her question hung in the air like a fragile thread, and for a moment, John didn't know how to answer. Forgiveness. Could he? Was he even capable of it? The anger, the hurt, the feeling of being betrayed, they were still there, simmering just beneath the surface. But then, as he looked at Janet, he saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was vulnerability, raw and real. She was waiting for him to take the first step, just as he had done for her, waiting for him to decide if he could open his heart again, even after everything that had happened. "I don't know if I'm ready," John said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready." Janet stepped closer, her heart visible in the way she moved. She didn't push him. She didn't rush him. She simply stood there, waiting for him, letting him process his emotions in his own time. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I won't rush you, but I want you to know that I'm here, whenever you're ready." Her words struck him harder than he expected. They weren't filled with desperation. They weren't trying to force him into something he wasn't ready for. They were just honest. And in that moment, John felt something shift inside him. He had spent so much time blaming her, so much time carrying the weight of her betrayal. But what had it done for him? Had it made him stronger? Had it healed the wound? No. It had only kept him trapped in the past, unable to move forward. "Janet," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been so angry, so hurt. I've held on to this for so long, thinking that if I didn't, I'd somehow be punishing you, but I've been punishing myself too." Janet's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just reached out and gently took his hand, as if to say, "I'm here." "I'm scared," John admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Scared that if I forgive you, I'll be giving up on everything we had, that I'll be forgetting what you did." "I don't want you to forget, John," Janet said softly. "I don't want you to pretend it never happened. What I did was wrong. But I need you to know that I'm not the same person. I'm not the same person who made that mistake. I want to prove to you that I can be the woman you need me to be." John looked at her, the pain in his heart aching, but somehow softened by the sincerity in her voice. She had never asked him for this forgiveness before. She had never demanded it. She had only shown up day after day, trying to prove herself worthy of his trust. And in that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about pretending the hurt never existed. It was about choosing to move forward despite the pain. It was about allowing himself to heal, to trust again, even when it felt impossible. "I want to try," he said finally, his voice breaking as he spoke the words. "I want to try to forgive you. I want to try to trust you again." Janet's face lit up with relief, but she didn't say anything immediately. She just hugged him tightly, her tears falling freely now. John held her close, feeling the weight of everything they had been through, but also the promise of something new, something they could build together. "I'm so sorry, John," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to break us." "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you didn't, and I'm sorry too, for holding on to all that anger for so long, for not seeing you, for not seeing that you were trying to make it right." They stood there, holding each other, letting the weight of the moment wash over them. The pain was still there, but it was no longer suffocating. It was a part of their story, a chapter they had written together, and now they were choosing to write the next chapter, one of healing, of rebuilding, and of forgiveness. "I think we can do this," Janet said softly, pulling back slightly to look him in the eyes. "I think we can find a way to heal." John nodded, the tears finally slipping down his own face. "Yeah," he whispered, "we can." And for the first time in a long time he felt the chains of the past loosen, felt the possibility of a future where they could both be whole again. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be perfect, but they would face it together. And that, he realized, was enough. The sun had barely risen when John woke, its soft light filtering through the curtains. It was a new day, but for the first time in a long while it didn't feel like a day filled with dread. Instead, there was a stillness to the morning, a sense of quiet that hadn't been there before. It was like the world had paused just for a moment to let him breathe. He lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the house, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustling of the leaves outside the window. Janet was still asleep beside him, her steady breathing a reminder of how far they had come. They had been through so much, pain, betrayal, grief, and yet here they were, side by side, still trying, still fighting for each other. But there was something different now, something softer, a quiet understanding that they didn't need to rush, that healing wasn't a race. It was a journey. As he sat up slowly, careful not to wake Janet, he took a deep breath. There was a heaviness in his chest, but it didn't feel as suffocating as it once had. The anger, the hurt, it was still there, but it was no longer his constant companion. He was starting to feel something else now, something that had been buried beneath the pain. Peace. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions. Janet had kept her promises, showing up for him in ways he hadn't expected. They had talked, really talked. They had shared their fears, their regrets, and their hopes. But the real work What would make this last was still ahead. Trust, forgiveness, the kind of deep, unshakable peace that came when both of them knew they could stand on the same ground again. He glanced over at her, still sleeping soundly, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in years. She looked so vulnerable in her sleep, so unguarded. It made him ache, remembering the walls they had both built up over time. But now those walls were beginning to come down, brick by brick. John carefully stood and walked over to the kitchen. The house was still quiet, the usual sounds of the world just starting to wake up. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as he brewed a pot, each movement slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the peace he had finally found. For so long he had lived in a constant state of tension, always waiting for the next thing to go wrong. But now, in the stillness of the early morning, he realized he was no longer waiting. He was breathing, truly breathing, for the first time in months. When the coffee was ready, he poured himself a cup, the warmth of the mug steadying his thoughts. It was a small comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. He had learned to appreciate the small moments, the ones that didn't require any grand gestures or promises, just the simple act of sitting down together, of being present in the moment. That was enough. As he sat down at the kitchen table, his mind wandered back to the conversation they had the night before. They had finally spoken about the future. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without pain, but they had acknowledged the road ahead. They had acknowledged the hard work it would take to heal, to rebuild trust. And for the first time in what felt like forever, John felt a flicker of hope. Not the kind of hope that promised everything would be perfect, but the kind that told him they could make it through this. Together. The sound of footsteps brought him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Janet standing in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, but her eyes bright. There was a softness in the way she looked at him now, something that hadn't been there before, a kind of tenderness that made his heart ache. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice still thick with sleep. "Good morning," John replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He motioned toward the coffee. "Would you like some?" She smiled, nodding. "Yes, please." As she sat down beside him, their hands brushed briefly, a fleeting touch, but one that sent a jolt of warmth through him. It was as if she were reminding him that they were still here, still connected, still trying. "I've been thinking," Janet began, her voice soft, tentative, "about everything, about us." John looked at her, waiting for her to continue. His heart was racing, but in a way that felt hopeful, not fearful. "I know we've come a long way," she said, taking a deep breath. "But I also know that forgiveness, it's not a one-time thing, it's a process. I can't expect you to forgive me just because I've apologized. I know I have to show you that I mean it, that I'm really here, and that I'll always choose us no matter what." John nodded, his chest tight. He had heard her say it before, but this time it felt different. This time her words weren't just an apology, they were a promise. "I know," he said quietly, "and I think I'm starting to forgive you. Not all at once, but slowly, day by day. And maybe that's the way it's supposed to be." Janet reached out, taking his hand in hers. Her fingers were warm, her touch gentle but firm. "I'm so sorry, John. I'm sorry for everything I've done, but I need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know." For a moment they sat there in silence, the weight of their past still hanging in the air, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. It wasn't something that could be erased, but it was something they could move through together, and that was enough. "Let's take it one day at a time," John said softly, squeezing her hand. "Let's just keep moving forward." Janet nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm ready," she whispered. And in that moment, as they sat together hand in hand, John felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't complete, it wasn't perfect, but it was peace. Real, raw peace. The house had never felt more alive than it did in that moment. John sat by the window, watching as the evening sky shifted from gold to purple, the horizon painted with the last remnants of daylight. He could hear the soft hum of the world outside, the distant laughter of children playing in the street, the low murmur of a neighbor's television through the walls. It was all so normal, so quiet. And yet for John, it felt like the first time he was truly seeing the world around him. He had spent so many years trapped in the past, haunted by mistakes, held captive by betrayal. But now, as he sat there, he realized that the past no longer held the same power over him. The weight of it had started to lift, not because it was gone, but because he had made peace with it. And that was the first step toward something new. Janet was in the kitchen, her soft hum filling the air as she prepared dinner. It had become their routine now. Shared meals, quiet moments, the feeling of safety growing in the space between them. No longer were they two strangers bound by the remnants of their former lives. They were learning how to be simply together. John thought about what she had said earlier that day. The conversation had started like so many others, tentative, fragile, but this time there was no fear, no walls. There was only the space between them, open and waiting for whatever would come next. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Janet had asked, her eyes meeting his with that familiar softness. John had smiled, something in his chest loosening at the sincerity in her voice. "We have, but the road ahead, it's still unwritten, isn't it?" She had nodded, a smile curling at her lips. "Yeah, it's like we're starting from scratch, but this time we know what's at stake." And that was it. The future was unwritten. The weight of the past could only do so much. They could not rewrite the chapters that had come before, but they could choose how to move forward. They could choose what story they wanted to write together. And as he sat by the window, John realized that the choice was theirs to make. They could choose to live in the shadow of what had happened, or they could choose to step into the light, to build a future that was theirs to shape. "Dinner's ready," Janet's voice called out from the kitchen, pulling him from his thoughts. He stood up slowly, stretching his arms above his head before walking toward the kitchen. As he stepped into the room, he found Janet placing the last of the plates on the table. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, her face glowing with a quiet kind of happiness that John had not seen in a long time. And when she looked up at him, there was no trace of the guilt or fear that had once defined her. There was only the woman she had become in the weeks, the months, since everything had fallen apart. They sat down together, the table small but warm, the food in front of them simple yet comforting. It wasn't about the meal, it was about the moment. The simple joy of sharing a meal, of sitting across from each other, not as broken people, but as two people learning how to trust again. John took a bite of his food, the familiar taste grounding him, and for a moment he allowed himself to savor the peace that had settled in his heart. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting the past. It was the kind that came from accepting it, learning from it, and choosing to move forward despite it. "This feels good," Janet said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but there was something hopeful in the way she said it. "I never thought we'd get here." John looked up at her, meeting her gaze with a mixture of tenderness and understanding. "I didn't either," he admitted. "But we did. And I think we're both stronger for it." Janet's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm sorry, John. I'm so sorry for everything." John reached across the table, his hand finding hers, the touch grounding and steady. "We've been through a lot, Janet, and we've both made mistakes. But we're here now, together. That's what matters." She squeezed his hand, the warmth of her touch speaking volumes. "I never want to lose this. I never want to go back to the way we were." "You won't," he promised, his voice firm, filled with conviction. "I won't let you." There was a long pause, and in that silence they both understood something. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about choosing to live, choosing to love, even when it felt impossible. They had both been broken, but together they were learning how to rebuild. As they finished their meal, the sound of laughter echoed in the background. The kids had returned from playing outside, their voices full of energy and life, and for the first time in a long time, John felt a warmth settle in his chest, a sense of peace, the kind of peace that came when you knew you had made the right choice, not because everything was perfect, but because you had chosen to keep going, to keep fighting for the things that mattered. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch together, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the TV in the background, John found himself looking at Janet, really looking at her. He saw the woman she had become, the woman he was still falling in love with, and in that moment he realized that the future was unwritten, but it was theirs to create, together, and no matter what came next, that was enough.